She spent her life fighting a system. She built her identity around resistance. She became the face of black radical politics in America, the raised fist, the afro, the FBI's most wanted list, and then DNA told a different story. Not a story that erased what she stood for, a story that complicated it in ways nobody saw coming. A story that reaches back further than any manifesto, further than any ideology, further than the American system she dedicated her life to dismantling. Angela Davis did not know this story. Not fully, not the way science now allows us to know it. What the genetic record revealed about her ancestry is not a contradiction. It is something more unsettling than that. It is a confluence, the meeting of bloodlines that should never have crossing anyway, producing a woman who would one day stand in front of the world and demand that America answer for what it had done. Before we dive in, comment where you are watching from and click subscribe. Start with what Angela Davis knew. She was born in Birmingham, Alabama in 1944. Not just any Birmingham, the Birmingham of Bull Connor and fire hoses and church bombings. The Birmingham where the geography of a neighborhood was itself a political statement, where black families lived on specific streets, sent their children to specific schools, and understood without being told that the city had been organized around their containment. Her parents were educated. Her mother, Sally Davis, was a school teacher and an activist with the Southern Negro Youth Congress. Her father ran a service station. They were not poor. They were something more dangerous than poor in the eyes of the system that surrounded them. They were conscious. Angela Davis grew up knowing what she was up against. She did not need anyone to explain American racism to her. She had grown up inside it, in one of its most brutal expressions, watching it operate with institutional confidence on the streets of her own city. She grew up 4 blocks from the 16th Street Baptist Church. In 1963, when she was 19 years old, a bomb planted by members of the Ku Klux Klan killed 4 girls inside that church. She knew 2 of them personally. Their names were Addie Mae Collins and Denise McNair. That is not background, that is biography. That is the specific texture of a life that produces a certain kind of person. She went on to study in Frankfurt under Herbert Marcuse. She joined the Communist Party. She was fired from her position at UCLA by Ronald Reagan. She was arrested, imprisoned, tried, and acquitted. During the 16 months she spent in jail awaiting trial, solidarity campaigns emerged on 6 continents. John Lennon wrote a song about her. The Rolling Stones mentioned her by name. Heads of state demanded her release. She had become, without choosing it, a symbol of something that extended far beyond any single country or any single struggle. When she was acquitted in 1972, she walked out of that courtroom into a world that had decided she represented something. She spent the rest of her life trying to be worthy of what people had projected onto her, and trying to redirect that projection towards the structural realities she believed actually mattered. She went on to teach at universities across the country. She wrote books that are still assigned in college courses today. She spoke on stages on every continent. She did not retire from the argument. She deepened it. Decade after decade, she returned to the same core question. Not who is guilty, but what is the system and how does it reproduce itself? Each decade, she found new evidence that the answer had not changed as much as the world liked to believe. Her identity was not a performance. It was a conclusion drawn from evidence. The evidence of her own life, her own city, her own century. And yet behind all of it, behind the ideology and the activism and the decades of scholarship, was a biological history she could not have constructed and did not choose. That history is what DNA recovered. Here is the problem that faces any attempt to trace Angela Davis's ancestry backward through American records. It is the same problem that faces every Black American family that existed before emancipation. It is the wall. The wall is 1870. Before the Civil War ended, enslaved people in the United States were not recorded as individuals in any document that survives with useful detail. They were listed as property, counted in aggregate, assigned values, given no names in the official record, no origins, no family structures that the state considered worth preserving. The 1870 census was the first in which formerly enslaved Black Americans were recorded as named human beings, which means the paper trail for Angela Davis's family, like the paper trail for millions of Black American families, ends at a wall, built not by accident but by design. Slavery did not simply exploit people, it deliberately unmade their histories. It stripped languages and names and lineages with the specific intention of producing people who did not know where they came from. People without deep roots are easier to control. People who cannot point to a homeland, a people, a continuous tradition stretching back before their captivity, those people are easier to keep in a system designed to hold them. Angela Davis spent her career analyzing that system, writing about it, teaching it. She understood, with a clarity that very few scholars have matched, exactly how American racial capitalism operated and what it required of the people it exploited. What she could not fully know, what no document could have told her, was the specific biological truth of her own position inside that history. That is what the DNA revealed. The genetic analysis of Angela Davis's ancestry draws on the same methodology used to trace the origins of other African American public figures, whose family histories were similarly obscured by the mechanisms of slavery. Autosomal DNA analysis captures the full picture across both sides of the family, the contributions of all ancestors going back 5 to 8 generations, expressed as percentages matched against reference populations from around the world. Mitochondrial DNA goes somewhere different and in some ways deeper. It traces only the direct maternal line, mother to mother to mother, in an unbroken chain that stretches back not decades but millennia. It produces a haplogroup, a genetic signature that connects a living person to a specific branch of the human family, rooted in a specific region of the world at a specific moment in deep human history. Together, these two tools do not give you names. They give you origins. They tell you probabilities, not absolutes. The science is honest about its limits, and so are we. What genetics can do is confirm the broad shape of a biological history that was deliberately erased. It can reach through the wall. It cannot tell you everything on the other side, but it can tell you enough. And what it found in Angela Davis's profile was enough to reframe everything. The first result confirmed what her family history suggested, but with a specificity that no family story could have provided. Angela Davis's ancestry is predominantly West African. The regional markers in her genetic profile are consistent with populations from present-day Cameroon, Nigeria, and the broader Gulf of Guinea region, one of the most significant corridors of the Atlantic slave trade and one of the most culturally rich regions of the African continent. This is not a vague finding. West Africa is a continent's worth of diversity compressed into a geographic designation that flattens enormous differences between peoples, languages, and traditions. The specific markers in Angela Davis's profile narrow it considerably. The Gulf of Guinea region, encompassing what is today southeastern Nigeria, Cameroon, and Equatorial Guinea, was home to some of the most sophisticated and resilient cultures in pre-colonial Africa. The peoples of this region were not passive recipients of colonial violence. They fought, they organized, they maintained cultural continuity under conditions designed to destroy it. The Igbo people, whose territory sits within this genetic range, are notable among historians of the slave trade for one particular fact: their resistance. Igbo captives were known among enslavers as among the most difficult to hold. There are documented cases of mass resistance, collective refusal, organized uprising. The Igbo landing of 1803, in which a group of captive Igbo people, upon arriving in Georgia, collectively chose death over enslavement, remains one of the most studied acts of resistance in the entire history of American slavery. But resistance among Igbo captives was not only dramatic and collective, it was also daily and quiet. It showed up in the refusal to adopt the religious practices of enslavers, in the preservation of language fragments, naming traditions and spiritual beliefs that survived the Middle Passage in altered but recognizable form, in the particular insistence on dignity that enslavers documented with frustration in their own records, a quality they could not understand and could not fully suppress. The genetic markers in Angela Davis's profile carry the echo of those people. She did not inherit their resistance as a philosophy. She may have inherited it as something older than philosophy. The second finding is the one that gives this story its specific weight. Angela Davis carried significant European DNA. The estimates place the European contribution to her genetic profile somewhere in the range of 20 to 30%, a figure consistent with a family history that spans multiple generations of slavery-era contact between black women and white men under conditions that were, in the overwhelming majority of cases, not consensual. This needs to be said directly. The European DNA present in Angela Davis's genome does not represent cultural mixing or voluntary union in any meaningful statistical sense. It represents the legacy of systematic sexual violence against enslaved women. It represents a pattern so widespread, so structurally embedded in American slavery, that geneticists can now read its consequences in the genomes of millions of living black Americans. The men who carried out that violence owned the legal system. They wrote the laws, they built the courts, they constructed the very apparatus of American institutional power that Angela Davis would spend her life analyzing and opposing. And their DNA is inside her. That is not a contradiction. It is a data point that illustrates at the biological level exactly what she was describing at the structural level. The system she critiqued did not stay outside her body. It entered her bloodline. It became part of her genetic inheritance. And she spent her life in a form of irony so deep it barely qualifies as irony anymore, using the intellectual tools of the same Western tradition that produced that violence, namely Marxist theory, critical philosophy, and academic scholarship, to expose and dismantle the system that created her. The DNA does not undercut what she stood for. It confirms it from the inside. This is where the story goes somewhere most people are not expecting. The mitochondrial DNA, the direct maternal line, traces Angela Davis's ancestry through her mother and her mother's mother in an unbroken chain that predates the Atlantic slave trade, predates the colonial encounter, predates every political category that would eventually be used to define her. The mitochondrial DNA haplogroup identified in Angela Davis's maternal line falls within the L-clade, the macro haplogroup that encompasses the oldest human maternal lineages on Earth. Specifically, her maternal line traces to sub-Saharan Africa, to a lineage that genetic researchers have connected to population movements occurring tens of thousands of years before the first written record, before the first empire, before the first organized state of any kind. Let that land. Angela Davis, professor, activist, Communist Party member, symbol of black radical resistance, woman whose face appeared on wanted posters and revolutionary posters simultaneously, carries in her cells a maternal lineage older than every ideology she ever encountered, older than Marxism, older than capitalism, older than the nation state, older than the concept of race itself. The direct maternal line that produced her has been passed from mother to daughter, unbroken, for tens of thousands of years, through the Gulf of Guinea, across the Atlantic, through the machinery of American slavery, through the Jim Crow South, through Birmingham, Alabama, and into a woman who looked at the system that surrounded her and decided with full clarity that it was wrong and that she would say so regardless of what it cost her. The thread was not cut, it bent. It crossed an ocean under conditions of maximum violence. It survived. Now we reach the place the science cannot go. Angela Davis built her identity on analysis, on structural critique, on the argument that race is not a biological fact, but a political construction, a tool invented by specific people at a specific moment in history to serve specific economic interests. She has made this argument in books, in lectures, in courtrooms and in classrooms for more than 50 years. She is not wrong about this. Race, as a social category, is a construction. The boundaries between who counts as black and who counts as white have shifted repeatedly throughout American history based on legal convenience, economic necessity, and political calculation. The one-drop rule was not a genetic discovery. It was a legislative decision. And yet, the DNA does not care about any of that. The DNA does not know what race means. It does not organize itself according to the categories that American law invented. It carries information that is older and more specific, and in some ways more honest than any political category ever devised. What it shows about Angela Davis is this: she carries the genetic inheritance of West African people who resisted their captivity at every opportunity. She carries the biological legacy of sexual violence committed by men who built and defended the exact system she dedicated her life to opposing. And she carries a maternal lineage so ancient it predates the concept of resistance itself, a lineage that simply endured because endurance is what it had always done. She was not born into this story by choice. Nobody chooses their ancestry, but the story her DNA tells is not separate from the story she chose to tell with her life. They are the same story, narrated at different speeds. Here's what the genetic record makes undeniable. The system Angela Davis spent her life critiquing was not something that happened around her. It happened inside her bloodline. The violence she described in academic language, the exploitation, the extraction, the deliberate destruction of black identity and continuity is written in her own genome. The European DNA in her profile is not an asterisk. It is evidence. Evidence of exactly what she said was happening, confirmed at the molecular level. The West African ancestry is not background color. It is specific. It connects her to peoples whose resistance to colonial violence is documented and celebrated. Peoples who did not accept what was being done to them. Peoples who, when they could not escape it, found ways to carry their identity forward anyway. In music, in language, in spiritual practice, in the stubborn biological persistence of a maternal line that refused to end. Angela Davis did not know she was descended from people like that. She knew she was one of them. The DNA confirmed the lineage. And here is the question it cannot answer. Angela Davis argued for decades that race is a construction, that the categories used to divide people are invented, not natural, that biology does not determine political destiny. The DNA shows something that cuts across that argument without quite contradicting it. It shows that the specific people her ancestors were before the construction of race, before the invention of the categories, before America existed at all, were already the kind of people who did not submit easily. They passed something forward through every catastrophe visited upon them. They produce, tens of thousands of years later, a woman in Birmingham, Alabama, 4 blocks from a church that would be bombed, who looked at the most powerful country in the world and said, "This is wrong, and I will not pretend otherwise." Is that inheritance, or is it coincidence? Is the resistance biological, or is it chosen? Or is the whole point that after a certain depth of history, the distinction stops mattering? Drop your answer in the comments, because that question doesn't have a clean resolution. It has only honest engagement. Angela Davis spent her life insisting that the personal is political, that where you come from shapes what you see, that the body carries history whether you choose to acknowledge it or not. The DNA agrees with her. It just extends the timeline further back than she may have imagined, past Birmingham, past slavery, past the founding of the country, past the construction of race, all the way back to a woman in sub-Saharan Africa whose name we will never know, who passed something forward into the dark, and whose unbroken line ends for now with one of the most recognizable voices for justice the 20th century produced. That is not a contradiction of everything she stood for. That is the foundation of it. If this story made you think, share it. If you want to know what DNA revealed about another icon whose ancestry quietly rewrites everything you thought you understood about them, the next video is already waiting.